Hey everybody, this is Perch. Here's a mail honoring a title that was good, and I believe, and granted, my memory is shit, and there's been thousands of videos, but I think I did a retrospective on this story with Larry, which you can kind of look up and find in the archives. I think in comic reviews or somewhere. But let's read this mail because this is a great comic, and it's never too late to kind of go over it. And there's another point that I've been thinking about a lot lately in terms of kind of art acceptance and the diversity of artists. And what I mean by diversity here is style, not human traits, but how they draw. So let's get to this mail. We'll get into it. It says, "Dear Perch, about 2 hours ago, I finished reading Barry Windsor Smith's Weapon X story, and damn, that was an addicting read. Every time I told myself that I was going to put it down to submit a piece of schoolwork, I just flew past it. The fact that it's a Wolverine story where it's about him, but he isn't the main character, was something I was completely unaware of. It's a horror story with Logan in the role of the monster, but man is the real monster in it. I was also really surprised how sympathetic, in some regards, most of Weapon X scientists are besides the professor. What a great read and great art. Really shows you what you can do with these characters and how interesting you can make a story centered around scientists doing unethical things to somebody. We should be talking about this book more. Also, Batman the Cult, because that book rocks. It came to mind because I keep seeing the long overdue hardcover. Both those books absolutely rock, and I'm going to mention this. There's another email I'm going to go to for a second, and then I'll come back. This guy also wrote in a mail saying, "What was my recommendation for great Halloween comics?" And brought up the haunting Halloween novel, The Long Halloween. Anyway, I'll go into this mail probably another time because I think there's a lot of good comics, but those two are pretty damn awesome. And I do think Wolverine Weapon X, I mean, it's a Frankenstein type story. It clearly gets some inspiration there, but there's a horror element to it for sure. And then Batman the Cult is just that's just a tremendous comic that people should read. I mean, those two would be great Halloween picks for sure. But talking specifically about the Wolverine Weapon X, a couple things that if you weren't alive when this was going on, you might not know. First of all, this was originally made in Marvel Comics Presents. And it was pretty wild at the time because Marvel Comics Presents was an anthology series. And it wasn't, it was often not stories that really mattered. What I mean by that is, they would kind of, it was like anthology stories. They meant a hell of a lot more than they do today. But by and large, and especially as the series wore on, it started to feel like kind of backup stories. You got to see, characters, and in some cases, characters you didn't see a lot of, get a chance to be in a small spotlight, and that was cool. But it really didn't. They weren't consequential stories a lot of the time. Now, Wolverine, of course, was a very popular character, and Marvel Comics Presents, in my opinion, was looking for a bit of a sales boost. That's kind of where it came about. So they said they were going to run this Wolverine Weapon X story, and it was billing itself as the origin of Wolverine. And at the time, that was pretty wild that they'd be putting the origin of Wolverine, which was kind of a closely guarded secret and kind of a big deal, in Marvel Comics Presents. That didn't track. And then Barry Windsor Smith, at the time, was seen as a pretty kind of special, epic artist. He'd done these stories in Uncanny X-Men, the Life Death comics with Storm, and he just the detail and the depth and the complexity. So when you had Barry Windsor Smith on there, you felt like you were getting an artist that probably took a long time to do those pages and probably was expensive. I remember, as a kid, conversations around how could they afford to get Barry Windsor Smith? I have no idea what his page rate was at the time, but both these things, you've got Wolverine, you've got the origin of Wolverine, and you have this Barry Windsor Smith guy doing this story in a place like Marvel Comics Presents felt wild. And it also meant that you were getting these shorter stories. And if you read the current Weapon X collected story, it comes in little bits. It comes, you have 6 pages or whatever, and then you move to the next chapter. And if you read it all at once, there's a certain momentum and pace to it. And by the way, I think there's an interesting clue there for American comics. The same thing is true with a lot of manga. When it's serialized, when it's in these kind of anthology books or put out that way, they're shorter stories. You don't get 22 pages at a time. You get these shorter bursts. But the writing and art, when you get somebody who truly masters kind of that amount of story, it has the feeling of a very fast paced, very frantic, and I mean it in a good way, story. And if you're doing something superhero, something horror related, something kind of with creeping dread, it really works. And I think when you read that story, it works. Like you said, when you read it all collected, it has this feeling of momentum and can't put it down. That I think if this comic was originally coming out in a 22 page format, it may not have had. It would have had a little bit more decompression. It would have been just a little different. And so I think the format really works. If you haven't read this comic, it is tremendous. It's really good. It is an example of show don't tell in a lot of cases. The art really did the talking for it. The characters, I think, did a really good job. Now they if you've read a lot of Wolverine over the years, they've retconned and changed and effed with this story, to no end, to its detriment. So if you can kind of memory wipe yourself with some of the things that they've done with Wolverine's origin, post this, that's a good thing. But at the time, this story was enough. It satisfied this feeling of Wolverine was tortured. It was brutal. It was visceral. It was this kind of mutant experimentation. It was wild and savage. And in many cases, this origin to Wolverine, which wasn't a full origin, I mean, we didn't learn, things that Joe Quesada would do, years later with Wolverine origin, but it was enough. You felt good. In fact, if anything, revealing more than this story hurt the character. It actually this story was perfect, and it gave you a glimpse into his past and his origin, but it also left plenty of mystery in the who the character is and how it came about. It was enough. It just worked. I think in so many ways, this comic represents sort of the kind of storytelling, in a weird way, restraint that you had before, and kind of what Marvel grew into being, which was having to just anything that remotely was popular, just milk it to death until it was a mummified version of itself. This story was weirdly restrained. As I mentioned, it came out in an odd comic. It came out in a serialized book. It took a long time to be collected. I mean, I take it back. They did a collection fairly quickly after this came out, but then they didn't touch it for a long time after. They put a nice little hardcover. I remember with Smith. It was in the same format of that Punisher Big Game, or no, Big Nothing. It was in the same kind of format as that. But and by the way, what a time it was. You get a Barry Windsor Smith story, you get a Mike Zeck story over on Punisher. Like, holy shit, these are just masters doing amazing work on the characters. But go check this out if you haven't read this. If you're some weird anomaly, you've never read the Barry Windsor Smith, Wolverine Weapon X. It's a relatively quick read. It's again another example of you not reading 500 pages of story. It flows nice and quick again because the art does a lot of the talking for it. It's not cluttered with bubbles. But it's a wonderful example of how to treat a character really well, how to reveal and maintain mystique at the same time, and it's a great book. The thing I mentioned and referenced a little earlier was it really highlighted at the time that you had, an Art Adams, a Todd McFarlane, a Drawn Byrne, a Barry Windsor Smith, a Mike Zeck. You had a George Perez. You had this collection of artists, and if you look at them, you pile them all next to each other. They had very distinctive styles. They were not the same. Mike Mignola versus a John Byrne is as different as it gets. Walt Simonson thrown in there. The really cool part about diversity in comics in terms of style was you really had, very different looking books depending on where you went. Today, there's a lot less of that in the big two. It hasn't gone all the way to a house style, and definitely there's a big difference between R.B. Silva and Dan Mora, but there's still a lot more similarity in those styles than you think of when you compare like an Art Adams to Bill Sienkiewicz to Barry Windsor Smith. You have very, very different looks of art. And I'd love if a lot of people pine for kind of the golden era of comics and to get back to there. That's what area I would really love to get back to. I would love for artists to, be allowed to unleash themselves creatively and get these really different, really distinctive styles. It worked. Comics were selling really well back then. I think the argument, and I had this very passionate argument a while back with some editors who were saying, basically, people wouldn't accept a Sienkiewicz or a Barry Windsor Smith or a Walt Simonson today. It's just too different. It's too, the style is old, but also it just, superhero comics has a certain look. And in many cases, they blame manga. They say, well, look at manga. Manga has very, very similar styles. Almost everything looks exactly the same. That's not true, by the way, at all, unless you're one of those people who are like, they all have big eyes, so it's all the same. But I think that's one of the bigger things we've lost that I don't hear enough people talk about is the diversity in art styles where you could truly pick up like 4 different books and get 4 wildly different, pieces of art. You can still do that today if you're willing to delve into indies. But I'm talking just within Marvel itself. You can get 4 very, very different art styles and very, very good art styles. So, I mean, it's not just that 4 people drew differently. It's 4 people mastered the way they drew differently. Like, Art Adams next to a John Byrne, next to a Mike Zeck, next to a Michael Mignola, next to a Barry Windsor Smith. You'd be hard pressed not to say those were masters of their craft. I mean, they all looked amazing, but they all looked radically different, and that was pretty cool. Anyway, let me know what you think. If you haven't read Weapon X, why not? Go do it. Stop commenting on this video. Get out there and do it. Like, pull the car over, find this book, and read it now. Anyway, thank you very much for the email and the good memories. Go check out that other video too of Larry and I talking about Weapon X. Thanks for listening.